There is a particular sound a life makes when it breaks. Not a scream, not at first. It is the soft flap of a red letter through a polished front door in Surrey. It is the click of a card machine failing in a London pub just as the winter crowd arrives. It is the silence after a pension statement is opened, and the room realizes the numbers were never real, merely polite. A gilt screen in the city flashes red, a heating bill quadruples in the dark, a remortgage offer lands like a surgical instrument. HMRC waits with the patience of an undertaker. A prepayment meter blinks in mid-December. Somewhere, a high court enforcement agent adjusts his gloves before knocking, because the system, when it comes to collect, prefers theater. Sir Josiah Stamp put it rather too clearly for comfort. Banking was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create deposits. And with the flick of the pen, they will create enough deposits to buy it back again. And still, people bowed to credit. They mistook deposits for wealth, leverage for brilliance, rising asset prices for virtue. They saw figures on screens and called it prosperity. They borrowed against tomorrow and called it strategy. They trusted the machinery because the machinery wore a tie, used long words, and sent its ruin on letter-headed paper. In this film, you will witness 10 stories from modern Britain, 10 lives linked by the same old fraud. A banker who believed himself cleverer than the market, a publican who trusted the numbers the bank placed before her, a consultant who remortgaged dignity, a solicitor trapped in negative equity, a landlord flayed by HMRC, an architect erased by inflation, a pension manager destroyed by policy reversal, a retiree betrayed after a lifetime of obedience, a data engineer crushed by red letters, and a distributor who kept the costume of wealth right up until the bailiffs took the motor car. This is not a story about bad luck. It is a story about greed and the exquisite stupidity of human beings who keep mistaking a debt-based system for civilization. Alistair was 52, which in the city is the age at which vanity becomes a management style. He had the silver at the temples, the cultivated baritone, the cufflinks that implied restraint while shouting inheritance. He sat in a walnut-paneled office and believed with that peculiarly British form of overconfidence that he was not merely participating in the market, he was interpreting it for lesser men. He had done well for himself, or rather, the system had done well for him and allowed him to confuse the favor with talent. Cheap money had lasted so long that it felt moral. Repo funding had become air. Leverage had become grammar. Gilts were meant to be safe, respectable, almost clerical in their dullness. And so Alistair did what ambitious men always do when a system rewards paper expansion. He borrowed scale and called it intellect. The numbers grew, positions widened, risk committees were soothed with presentations written in the anesthetic dialect of finance. Exposure became optimized yield enhancement. Fragility became temporary duration sensitivity. The old lie was polished yet again. That abstraction could abolish consequence. Sir Josiah Stamp had already warned them, of course, give bankers the power to create deposits and they will buy back the earth with a flick of the pen. But warning is wasted on men whose income depends upon ignoring it. Then came the Gilt Market Meltdown, that dreary, magnificent British moment when centuries of institutional confidence were thrashed by arithmetic. Yields leapt, collateral thinned, screens turned red with such speed that the dealing room looked less like a workplace and more like a sacrificial chamber. Alistair stared at the terminal as though betrayal were somehow bad manners. He was offended, you see, that reality had interrupted him. The margin call arrived without drama, which made it all the more lethal, more collateral, immediately. No flattery, no discretion, no deference to his title, just the cold invoice for leverage he had mistaken for genius. This is the vulgar magic of banking. Men create claims out of almost nothing. then perish the moment someone requests something solid. He began to liquidate. Positions were dumped into a falling market. Losses hardened from theory into fact. Liquidity vanished at precisely the instant it was required, as it always does. He had spent years speaking of depth, resilience, and market structure in handsome conference rooms. Now he discovered that the floor beneath his own life was decorative oak laid over open air. At home in Surrey, the performance began to crack. The kitchen still looked expensive, which is not quite the same thing as being secure. His wife asked whether matters were serious. He answered in the language of every collapsing Englishman of status: measured tone, narrow detail, exquisite dishonesty. He spoke as though this were a temporary dislocation. He did not say the truth aloud. Bonus evaporated, deferred compensation in question, prestige already cooling in other men's eyes. And because finance is never content to die alone, Alistair's collapse traveled outward. Credit lines were reviewed, hospitality exposure was reclassified. Non-core borrowers were politely prepared for suffocation. In a glass room beneath fluorescent light and words such as prudence, discipline, and portfolio hygiene, he signed off on tighter terms for ordinary businesses whose owners had never once laid a hand on a gilt. One of them was Beatrice. That is how contagion actually works, not as fireballs and sirens, but as committees, as covenant changes, as an overdraft quietly withdrawn from a woman trying to keep a pub warm in December. One man's leverage becomes another family's darkness. Alistair called it prudent balance sheet management. 1,000 lesser people would experience it as panic. There was no operatic punishment for him in the end. Britain is too tasteful for that. Instead, there was internal review, strategic restructuring, quiet exile from rooms that once welcomed him. Younger executives stopped making eye contact. HR developed a tone of false kindness. He was not dragged through the square. He was simply downgraded, which for men like Alistair is far worse. And so the first fracture appeared. A banker, convinced he was cleverer than the market, levered himself into ruin and then passed the invoice down the food chain. That is the real obscenity of the system Sir Josiah Stamp described. The men nearest the pen rarely absorb the full consequence. They export it, they socialize the rot, they call it risk transfer, and then seem faintly surprised when an entire country starts freezing in the dark. From Alistair came the first tightening of the noose. From that noose came Beatrice. Beatrice was 45 and owned the sort of London pub estate agents describe with erotic dishonesty. Characterful, thriving, perfectly positioned. It had brass taps, old mirrors, a chalkboard menu, a little patch of inherited nostalgia sold nightly by the pint. To outsiders, it looked like resilience. To the bank, it looked like collateral. To Beatrice, for a while, it looked like proof that hard work still mattered in Britain. She had believed the figures shown to her over the years. Turnover up, footfall strong, asset value rising, seasonal volatility manageable. The language was calm, spreadsheeted, almost tender in its deceit. Her bank manager spoke of expansion, refurbishment, modernization, opportunity. Credit was presented not as a leash, but as a partnership. Prosperity was measured in projected cash flows, and Beatrice, like so many practical people forced to kneel before finance, mistook projected numbers for reality. Then, energy prices rose with the sadistic grace only utility bills can achieve. The energy cap slaughter arrived not as a headline, but as repeated assault. Heating bill after heating bill. Winter projections revised upward, then upward again. The cost of keeping the place warm quadrupled. The ovens, cellar coolers, lights, gas, staff meals, supplier invoices, all of it thickened into a monthly sum so vulgar it ceased to feel numerical. It felt personal. Still, she fought. She trimmed menus, reduced hours, delayed maintenance, stopped paying herself. She put on lipstick and smiled at regulars while calculating, in the back of her head, how many pints it took to keep the radiators alive for another evening. This is one of Britain's filthiest little rituals. the owner performing stability, while the infrastructure of her life rots beneath the till. Then Alistair's world reached hers. The overdraft became conditional. The tone shifted. Calls were no longer collaborative. The bank that had once encouraged ambition now rediscovered morality and demanded discipline. Covenants tightened. Working capital vanished. The same system that had fed her prosperity on borrowed air now rebuked her for needing oxygen. And once the bank stepped back, every predator grew bolder. Suppliers shortened terms. The landlord grew formal. Utility firms stopped pretending to care. Each envelope through the door carried another version of the same message. Pay in pounds you do not have, or we will begin removing the parts of your life that remain decorative. Her staff watched the lights dim in stages. First, fewer shifts, then unpaid overtime hidden as loyalty. Then the quiet humiliation of telling adults with rent to pay that the rota had collapsed. Among the staff was a woman whose husband, Colin, still believed his middle-class respectability offered some protection from events such as these. How adorable. Beatrice sold stock below margin to keep cash moving. She switched off heating in unused rooms. She stood in the cellar in a coat reading invoices as though numbers might soften if stared at with sufficient force. But the arithmetic was pitiless. Energy does not care about charm. Banks do not care about community. Markets do not care that a pub is where people gather after funerals, redundancies, and football matches to pretend Britain still has a communal heart. The end was not cinematic. There was no shattering glass, no dramatic final order. Just a night when the rooms felt too cold, the till too light, the account too empty. A business that had fed people for years was strangled by costs created elsewhere and by credit withdrawn by men who had already torched their own books. Beatrice had trusted prosperity drawn by bankers on paper. Now she discovered it had been penciled in. When the staff went, they took more than labor with them. They carried the damage into their homes. One lost wage becomes two unpaid direct debits. One closed pub becomes a marriage under strain. One business failure becomes the beginning of a remortgage crisis in an entirely different postcode. This is how systems kill, politely, incrementally, by turning every relationship into a transmission belt. So, Beatrice fell, not because she was idle, not because customers abandoned her, not because the pub lacked meaning. She fell because the bank fed her illusion, the energy market flayed her, and the credit line was yanked just as winter arrived. The lights went dim, the cellar ran silent, and another ordinary British enterprise was offered up to the god of abstraction. From Beatrice came a redundancy, and from that redundancy came Colin. Colin was 38, an NHS consultant, the sort of man Britain tells to feel grateful while quietly billing him for the privilege. He had done everything correctly, which is often the first mistake. He studied hard, delayed gratification, married sensibly, bought a decent house, fixed the mortgage at 1.5%, and told himself he had entered that tired old national fantasy, the professional middle class, insulated by effort and credentials. His wife worked at Beatrice's pub, handling rotas, stock orders, impossible customers, and the subtle emotional labor of hospitality. It was not the glamorous half of the household economy, but it held the monthly machine together. Two incomes made the mortgage civilized. Two incomes kept the nursery costs, petrol, council tax, and supermarket insult within tolerable range. Two incomes created the illusion of slack. Then the pub went under, and one income vanished. Colin told himself they could bridge it. Professionals always do it first. They make spreadsheets. They rationalize. They speak in phrases such as temporary pressure and rebalancing expenditure, as though using a more expensive vocabulary makes the cliff less steep. But the fixed rate mortgage was expiring, and the remortgaging cliff stood ahead like a pale official waiting to check papers. The new offer came through. Same house, same street, same family, different interest rate. Monthly payments nearly doubled. Nothing visible had changed except the price of money, which in Britain can apparently redefine a life more thoroughly than illness. Colin, who had spent years saving other people's bodies, now watched a lender dissect his own household with mechanical precision. He cut what he could, gym membership gone, streaming gone, holidays canceled, better wine replaced by silence. Then came the humiliations that bite deeper because they are domestic, choosing which bill could be delayed, pretending not to notice the supermarket total, calculating whether the car was still a necessity or merely a memory of dignity. This is where the middle class truly panics, not when it is poor, but when it can see poor from the driveway. And still, he clung to image. He went to work in his consultant suit. He signed forms, spoke in measured clinical tones, delivered confidence to patients he envied for being allowed to collapse honestly. At home, he began to fray. The mortgage letter sat on the kitchen table like an accusation. His wife, jobless and ashamed, apologized for a redundancy she had not caused. He reassured her because that is what decent men do, even while silently blaming her for a catastrophe engineered several strata above them both. He sought relief, a bridge, a guarantee, some legal workaround to buy time against interest. That is how Daphne entered the story. She agreed to back a legal debt arrangement connected to the family, the sort of favor professionals perform for one another while imagining themselves still inside a stable order. Colin told himself it was temporary. They all do. But a remortgage cliff is not a mood. It is mathematics with stationery. When the fixed deal ended, the new payment struck the household like blunt trauma. Colin's salary, respectable on paper, always the Treasury's favorite word, suddenly looked indecently small beside the outgoings. Here was the British middle class in its purest modern form, asset-rich by estate agent fantasy, cash-poor by every monthly reality, trapped inside a house purchased at the peak of delusion. Arguments multiplied. Sleep thinned. Shame entered the marriage like damp. He stopped opening letters immediately because he already knew the tone. School costs, insurance renewals, utilities, fuel, food. Each item seemed to have joined a conspiracy against the notion that a doctor ought to feel secure. And somewhere under the practical fear was a more toxic realization. His honor had been mortgaged right alongside the property. He missed payments, not all at once, first one late, then a partial, then the lender's language hardened. This is how credit disciplines the respectable, not by public whipping, but by correspondence. Colin discovered that titles, degrees, and NHS service count for very little when a direct debit bounces. The system that applauds your sacrifice will still repossess your pretensions. His default hit Daphne, who had guaranteed part of the legal arrangement. One family's failed bridge became another woman's anchor. That is the domino logic of debt. Every attempt to survive transfers pressure sideways until the whole network starts to crack. Colin had not been reckless in the vulgar sense. He had merely believed that a fixed-rate era would last, that professional status would matter, and that the house was a home rather than a leveraged bet. He was wrong on every count. From Colin came default. From default came Daphne's trap. Daphne was 41, a solicitor in Surrey, accomplished, efficient, and fluent in the sort of clipped competence that persuades everyone around her she is safe. She lived in a handsome property whose valuation had risen with the obscene effortlessness of the era. Equity appeared on paper. Prosperity seemed confirmed. Like so many professionals, she confused an inflated house price with a moral compliment. She believed in order, in law, in contracts, in the sober dignity of doing things properly. This naturally made her perfect prey for a system that specializes in converting discipline into collateral. She had worked hard, billed hard, kept the office running, helped others structure risk, formalize obligations, and navigate the civilized paperwork of financial stress. There is no irony as cruel as a lawyer being strangled by the logic she once documented for clients. When Colin's household came under strain, Daphne had guaranteed a legal debt arrangement linked to the family, a favor, a professional courtesy, a bridge. The sort of thing one agrees to when one still imagines the wider machine is fundamentally functional. Then Colin began to buckle. Payments missed, promises stretched, explanations grew thinner, and the guarantee, so elegant in drafting, became brutally physical in consequence. At the very moment another household's failure was being redirected into her books, the property market turned. Rates rose, confidence evaporated. The old fiction that every house in the Southeast must rise forever gave way to a more vulgar truth. Some assets do, in fact, fall. Daphne looked up and found herself in negative equity. The mortgage balance sat above the market value. The home was no longer a ladder, it was a sealed chamber. That is the exquisite cruelty of negative equity. One cannot leave, one cannot sell, one cannot elegantly retreat. One simply remains, working harder to service an illusion that no longer flatters. Daphne could not move for work without crystallizing loss. She could not sell without bringing money she did not possess to the table. She could not think of the house as security, only as a debt monument with decent flooring. At the office, strain began to show in administrative ways, which is to say, the worst ways. Cash flow tightened, clients delayed settlement. Refinance work became more frantic and more brittle. Her own stress shortened her judgment. The firm's operations slowed, then stalled in places. Files that ought to have moved cleanly began to jam. One of those jammed files belonged to Edward, a buy-to-let investor needing refinancing. He had always relied on papers like Daphne's to keep debt rolling neatly into the next term, but her office, once a machine of order, was now moving through treacle. Here again the system showed its design. The distress of one middle-class professional becomes the liquidity crisis of another. Britain does adore a chain reaction wrapped in respectable stationery. At home, she stopped using certain rooms. Not to save heating, that humiliation belonged further down the chain, but because the house itself had become accusatory. Every wall carried the memory of a valuation that no longer existed. Estate agents' photographs now looked like propaganda from a dead regime. She had the address, the title deeds, the apparent success, but none of the freedom. And then came the deeper shame. Solicitors are expected to master contingency, yet here she was, snared by a guarantee in a market reversal, unable even to narrate the disaster cleanly. Friends asked whether she might simply sell and start again. Ah yes, simply, the favorite word of those who have never owed more on a property than it can fetch. She smiled tightly, as professionals do when they would rather bite through glass than confess entrapment. Her monthly life became a punishment of endurance. Work harder, bill more, service the mortgage, cover the guarantee, preserve the appearance of functioning. She did not collapse theatrically, she calcified. That is what debt often does to the competent. It turns them into elegant machines for the maintenance of their own imprisonment. Daphne had believed in prosperity. She had believed paper values meant something. She had believed a carefully drafted favor could remain contained. Instead, she discovered that in a debt-soaked system, nothing remains contained. A doctor's remortgage problem became a solicitor's legal burden. A solicitor's operational drag became a landlord's refinancing disaster. Every polished profession in Britain, it turned out, was standing on the same trapdoor. From Daphne's paralysis came Edward's squeeze. Edward was 55 and spoke about property with the devotional tone some men reserve for religion. He had spent years buying flats and small houses to let, each acquisition funded by debt and justified by the old catechism. Tenants pay the mortgage, values rise over time, leverage magnifies wisdom. In Britain, one can say almost anything absurd about property so long as one says it over lunch and calls it long-term investing. He was not a builder of homes, he was a collector of debt-backed assumptions with roofs attached. During the long age of cheap money, that was more than enough. Refinancing was routine. Interest-only arrangements kept the monthly sums civilized. Capital appreciation did the moral heavy lifting. Edward came to believe he was savvy when he was, in truth, merely upstream from monetary indulgence. Then rates shifted, paperwork slowed, and the grace period ended. Daphne's office, where his refinancing was meant to move cleanly, was now grinding under its own pressures. Delays lengthened. Lenders sharpened terms. The smooth roll from one debt period to the next began to snag. In a debt culture, timing is everything. A delayed signature can become a financial guillotine. As if that were not vulgar enough, HMRC arrived with the stealth tax raid, the kind of bureaucratic flaying performed under the banner of fairness. Thresholds stood still while inflation moved, reliefs narrowed, real purchasing power stagnated even as nominal sums shoved him into uglier brackets. On paper, he looked wealthier. In practice, more of him was being quietly carved away. Britain is rather gifted at that trick, making citizens feel richer until the tax code reminds them they are not. Edward's outgoings rose, mortgage costs swelled, maintenance ate through reserves, insurance climbed, tenants complained about repairs he could no longer comfortably fund, and HMRC, with its dry, patient appetite, treated every ledger as a confession waiting to be priced. He had built his life on overvalued assets financed by debt. Now both asset certainty and debt affordability were retreating in opposite directions. He began to stall payments, first to contractors, then to consultants, then to anyone unlikely to break down his front door in the next week. Among those left waiting was Fiona, an architect owed money for design work. Edward told himself it was temporary, merely a liquidity squeeze, a timing issue. It is extraordinary how often insolvency borrows the language of inconvenience. He looked at his portfolio and saw not prosperity, but exposure. Flats once admired as passive income now appeared as maintenance liabilities wrapped around remortgage risk. He had chased yield, scale, and tax efficiency. He had attended seminars where smooth men in blue suits spoke of financial freedom. How touching. He was now financially captive to rate resets, tax drag, and administrative delays in a legal office already crippled by another family's misfortune. The deeper humiliation was ideological. Edward had genuinely believed himself prudent because property looked tangible. Bricks, mortar, tenants, keys, nothing like those abstract city boys with their screens and derivatives. Yet his entire empire depended on the same thing they did, endlessly renewable cheap credit. Remove that and the difference between a gilt position and a semi-detached buy-to-let becomes largely aesthetic. He opened HMRC letters with the dread of a man reading his own obituary in installments. Numbers bled from every direction. What he owed the revenue, what he owed lenders, what he owed tradesmen, what he owed the fantasy of being a self-made property man in a country where so much self-making was merely debt taking a flattering portrait. The strangest part was that he still looked all right from the outside. That is Britain's speciality. Men go under in decent coats. The car remains polished for a while. The LinkedIn tone stays upbeat. The kitchen still photographs well. But inside, liquidity had curdled into fear. He began to ration who got paid and who did not. Fiona, at the wrong end of the queue, was left holding the emptiness. Edward was not destroyed by a single blow. He was squeezed between valuation delusion and tax reality, between stuck refinancing and higher rates, between a legal bottleneck and a state that always knows how to find its share. He had bought too much at too high a price using too much debt. HMRC did not create the delusion. It merely arrived in time to make the arithmetic fatal. From Edward's non-payment came Fiona's erasure. Fiona was 30, an architect, intelligent enough to see what was happening and still too junior to prevent any of it. She had not ruined herself through indolence. She had not gambled in the vulgar sense. She had simply entered adulthood at the exact moment Britain decided to grind the middle class into administrative mints. She rented well into the point at which earlier generations had already purchased. Her wages looked respectable until set beside London costs, student debt, commuting, rent, food inflation, and the endless nicking away of disposable life by every bill that arrives pretending to be ordinary. She worked on projects she could never afford to inhabit. There is something uniquely modern in designing the future for clients while being priced out of one's own. Edward owed her money for completed design work. That payment mattered. Not for yachts and nonsense, for rent, for overdraft breathing space, for the maintenance of a professional life that had no cushion. When he stalled, her accounts tightened at once. People with portfolios call this a delay. People without reserves call it panic. Her employer was already under strain. Construction slowed. Financing grew uncertain. Developers started pausing, reviewing, rephasing. Those elegant words used when cash has quietly fled the room. One of the firm's financing lines led by then into bonds held by Gareth's pension fund, which is to say, Fiona was working inside a structure being financed by the retirement hopes of strangers who had no idea their future income was tied to half-built aspirations and market sentiment. Then came the wider cost of living crisis, and with it, the daily obscenity of ordinary life, food inflation into double digits, wages stagnating with the dead expression of a civil servant withholding mercy, energy, transport, rent, all rising, all nibbling, and then tearing. Fiona discovered that the arithmetic of adulthood no longer rewarded competence, it merely penalized existence. She did what sensible young professionals do when crushed. She economized with a kind of private ferocity, cheaper supermarket lines, fewer trains, no holidays, obviously. Social life narrowed into excuses, heating delayed, savings, slight, embarrassed things, gone. Yet even austerity has a floor, and Britain had become skilled at lowering it beneath people just as they adapted. Then redundancy whispers began at the firm. Projects delayed, payments missed, credit conditions worsening. Fiona saw older colleagues pretending calm because they had mortgages, younger ones pretending indifference because they had none. She understood in a single bleak rush that she could do everything properly and still be selected for erasure by forces so broad and so indifferent they might as well have been weather. The middle-class promise had been sold to her as a straight line: education, profession, incremental advancement, eventual home ownership, modest security. Instead, she inherited a system in which inflation devoured raises, rent swallowed years, and one unpaid invoice from a debt-soaked landlord could knock the structure sideways. How magnificently efficient, how utterly rotten. When Edward failed to pay, it was not merely a missed invoice, it was proof that debt contagion travels downward faster than any opportunity ever rises. His tax drag became her rent anxiety. His refinancing failure became her grocery calculations. His squeezed portfolio became her shrinking world. This is what the architects of the system never mention in speeches. Leverage does not remain where it is booked. It leaks into kitchens, oyster balances, skip meals, postponed dentistry, and exhausted 30-year-olds staring at ceilings they do not own. Her firm's vulnerability deepened as construction finance curdled. Bonds that once looked like income in a pension portfolio now looked like paper waiting to burn. Gareth's fund would soon learn that lesson at scale. Fiona, much lower in the chain, learned it first in the body, through shallow sleep, clenched shoulders, and the steady humiliation of realizing she might be professionally respectable and economically disposable at the same time. She was not bankrupted by laziness. She was not feckless. She was simply alive in the wrong macroeconomic decade under a state and banking order that treated effort as a quaint personal hobby. By the time the payment never arrived and the job itself began to wobble, Fiona understood the deepest insult of modern Britain. One can be useful, qualified, industrious, and still be priced out of stability by systems designed elsewhere. From Fiona's employer and its financing rot came Gareth's reckoning. Gareth was 62, a pension fund manager, which means he spent his life converting promises about the future into present allocations, then praying the assumptions held. He wore caution like a virtue and spoke in basis points, duration, liability profiles, insolvency buffers. To the public, men like Gareth are meant to look boring. That is how trust is costumed. His fund held exposure where prudence was supposed to live: gilts, defensive structures, corporate bonds judged sensible enough for retirement money. Among them were bonds connected to the construction world Fiona worked in, the kind of instruments approved not because they were beautiful, but because they appeared tolerable within the architecture of yield-starved institutional finance. Everyone had been pushed outward for return. Everyone called the push diversification. Then, the macro point of fracture arrived. The Bank of England shifted policy with the blunt necessity of a surgeon sawing through bone. Gilt markets convulsed. Liability-driven strategies that relied on stable collateral and predictable movement began to choke. What had been sold as prudent hedging suddenly looked like leverage wearing sensible spectacles. Britain's retirement machinery, so proud of its actuarial decorum, was now inches from disgrace. Gareth watched screens with a sort of professional horror reserved for men who know exactly how many years of bland committee work are about to be invalidated by a single violent week. Yield spikes meant margin stress. Margin stress meant asset sales. Asset sales meant crystallized losses. The system designed to preserve pension promises was now threatening to annihilate them through the very structures meant to hedge them. One almost had to admire the perversity. And underneath it all was the same old arrogance Sir Josiah Stamp had diagnosed: the confidence that money claims can be multiplied indefinitely without moral or social consequence, then somehow made safe by institutional language. Gareth had not considered himself greedy. That was for traders, speculators, buy-to-let vulgarists. Yet greed had entered by another door: the hunger for a few extra points of return in a world starved by years of distortion. The corporate bonds linked to the construction sector deteriorated as financing conditions worsened, projects stalled, issuers weakened. Paper once filed under dependable income began to smell faintly of fraud and desperation. Fiona's collapsing professional world was, to Gareth's committee minutes, a mere credit event. That is the obscenity of scale. Entire livelihoods reduced to footnotes in a pension meeting pack. He convened calls, demanded updates, approved defensive adjustments that were no longer genuinely defensive. The whole room spoke in institutional calm while staring at a potential solvency event. This is how modern Britain does existential terror. In meeting rooms with biscuits, no one eats. The Bank of England's abrupt turn had transformed theoretical risk into immediate threat. Pension promises were no longer serene rows of actuarial projections. They were exposed flesh. At some point, Gareth realized the nightmare plainly. The retirement income of people who had done absolutely nothing wrong was now tied to the survival of leveraged structures in a convulsing bond market. Men had built pensions atop assumptions of order, then layered strategy upon strategy until the safety mechanism itself became a bomb. He carried the shame heavily because pension management is, in its moral aspiration, almost sacred. Ordinary people surrender slices of life across decades with the understanding that someone sober is standing watch. Gareth had believed he was that sober man. Now he was signing documents that acknowledged loss, contingency planning, and emergency responses. He was not merely managing volatility, he was presiding over betrayal. And among the names buried in the abstract member lists was Harriet, 70 years old, dutiful, retired, trusting. Her future had been portioned into income assumptions and inflation adjustments, all of it now endangered by the bond market violence and institutional greed Gareth could no longer pretend was merely technical. The fund did not collapse into cartoon rubble. It did something worse. It became uncertain. That uncertainty is poison to the elderly. A young person can imagine starting again. A pensioner cannot meaningfully compound time. Gareth knew that, which made every basis point of deterioration feel less like finance and more like moral corrosion. From Gareth's threatened fund came Harriet's vanished safety net. Harriet was 70. She had done everything the old Briton asked of her: worked, saved, paid in, deferred pleasure, trusted institutions, believed the tedious sermon that prudence would be rewarded, and that the state, the pension system, and the broad moral order would at least refrain from humiliating the obedient in old age. Poor woman. The pension statements had once looked modest but stable, the sort of quiet monthly dignity by which one buys groceries, keeps the boiler running, and avoids becoming a burden. Then Gareth's world faltered, and Harriet's world shrank. Not all at once, not with a shouted declaration, but through notices, revisions, uncertainty, changed assumptions, reduced confidence. The safety net did not so much tear as dissolve. There is a special indecency in impoverishing the elderly because they do not merely lose money, they lose proportion. Every expense begins to loom. Every winter, decision takes on theatrical cruelty. Harriet found herself calculating heat in hours rather than comfort in days. The house, once merely old, now seemed hostile. Rooms were closed off. Coats were worn indoors. Kettles became strategy. Then came the prepayment gas meter, that tiny machine of national shame. Mid-December, the sort of cold that gets into the wallpaper, Harriet standing in her own home as though she were visiting someone poorer, topping up warmth in increments, watching credit tick down with the intimacy of an execution clock. After a lifetime of compliance, this was the reward. Rationed heat in old age while better-dressed people discussed inflation persistence on television. She did not complain elegantly enough to be heard. That is another cruelty. The respectable elderly are often too proud to scream before the damage is obvious. Harriet merely adjusted, improvised, endured, smaller meals, fewer outings, a quieter life shrinking around bills. The pension, which had once signified independence, now looked like a note from a previous century, written before institutions learned to monetize betrayal with more finesse. Her grandson Ian noticed before anyone else fully understood. He saw the meter, the chill, the extra blanket, the peculiar way pensioners smile when concealing a financial emergency because they cannot bear to become tragic. He did what younger family members always do when systems fail. He used personal debt as an emergency state, credit cards, high interest, immediate relief purchased at future cost. Harriet resisted. Of course she did. That is what old decency does. It apologizes for being failed. Ian insisted. He topped up the meter, bought groceries, covered bits and pieces. There, in one small family act, the entire modern fraud stood exposed. The grand national retirement architecture had cracked, and an overburdened younger worker was now borrowing at appalling rates to keep his grandmother warm. The psychological humiliation was perhaps the worst part. Harriet had believed education, effort, and obedience meant something. Now she was choosing between warmth and dignity, while commentators bickered over policy nuance. It is amazing how cold theory sounds when one's fingers ache in one's own sitting room. She had not speculated, had not overborrowed, had not chased property seminars or leveraged returns. She had simply trusted that a pension was a pension, yet in a system organized around money creation, asset inflation, and perpetual financial engineering, even the patient saver is eventually crushed when the machinery misfires. The prudent become collateral damage for the ambitious. Harriet's life narrowed into ritual economies: meter, kettle, blanket, pill organizer, reduced shop, check the post, hope there is no new demand, smile when Ian visits, pretend the cold is manageable. That is how betrayal looks in old age, not melodrama, but diminished radius. Her suffering did not remain self-contained. It passed into Ian's wallet, his sleep, his future. One generation's pension failure became the next generation's unsecured debt problem. Britain had managed the neat trick of punishing thrift twice at once. From Harriet's freezing house came Ian's red letters. Ian was 32, a data engineer, one of those modern workers everyone assumes must be fine because the job title sounds expensive. He earned enough to look stable from a distance and not enough to absorb repeated emergencies without consequence. That, increasingly, is the sweet spot of contemporary ruin: respectable income, no real buffer, and a family network fraying under pressures created far beyond the household. When Harriet's pension safety net dissolved into winter humiliation, Ian stepped in. He put the gas on credit, groceries on credit, small rescues, then larger ones. The logic was easy at first. Help now, sort it later. A PR is a future problem. Nan is cold today. This is how unsecured debt seduces the conscientious, not through luxury, but through duty. At the same time, his own life was already expensive in all the usual invisible ways: rent or mortgage strain, commuting, subscriptions that no longer felt like leisure but infrastructure, insurance, council tax, food that had lost its mind, and the endless bite of existing in a country where every service seems to regard your monthly income as a rough estimate of what may be extracted. He could code systems elegantly enough. He could not code his way out of compound interest. Then the letters started. Not just statements, warnings, final notices, red print, deadlines, the sort of correspondence that seems to make a sound when dropped through the letterbox. He began to dread the mat. Every envelope was a demand from a past version of himself trying to protect someone he loved. Debt, in that sense, is memory weaponized. He also took equipment on credit from Jack, an electronics distributor, because modern work and survival increasingly depend on devices one cannot comfortably pay for outright. A replacement machine here, a finance setup there, may be justified by productivity, maybe by necessity, maybe by that distinctly millennial hope that one more practical expenditure will help stabilize the whole mess. But once cash flow frayed, even sensible purchases became liabilities waiting to mature into accusation. His salary entered the account and disappeared like a joke. Minimum payments kept balances alive but not declining. Interest accumulated with the dead patience of mold. He opened spreadsheets at night and discovered with animal fear that the paper obligations now exceeded what his monthly life could realistically carry. This is the terror of the indebted professional. Not poverty exactly, but the moment the equations cease to honor optimism. At work, he remained functional. Data pipelines, dashboards, systems architecture, the clean machine logic of code. Then he went home to the opposite: chaos priced by lenders. Britain does enjoy that contrast. It trains a generation to maintain elegant digital order, while their private finances resemble a Victorian debtor's kitchen with Wi-Fi. The red letters intensified: missed payment, final demand, potential escalation. His heartbeat changed in relation to post. He stopped buying things not because he had become virtuous, but because the margin for error had vanished. Yet emergencies do not stop because one is already drowning. Harriet still needed help. Fuel still cost money. Life kept arriving, invoice first. He considered consolidation, extensions, temporary relief, all the familiar pathways by which debt tries to rename itself less frighteningly. But the sums were ugly now, the credit profile bruised, the options narrowing. He had crossed that line known to millions and admitted by almost no one, the point at which the debt on paper is beginning to feel more powerful than the person who owes it. And when Ian began to fail, he did not fail alone. Jack had sold him electronics on credit and was waiting on the cash flow. A missed payment in one flat becomes a strain in one small business. That is the genius of the system. It distributes fragility through supply chains, households, and family loyalties until everyone is both victim and vector. Ian's fall was not glamorous. No yachts, no casinos, no cocaine and idiocy. He borrowed to work, to live, to help his grandmother survive winter. Then the letters turned red, the interest turned predatory, and his income, perfectly decent to a minister with no grocery bill, proved insufficient against the accumulating machinery of extraction. From Ian's default came Jack's enforcement. Jack was 45, an electronics distributor, a man who specialized in appearance because modern commerce practically demands it. The van had to look respectable. The office had to look functioning. The watch had to whisper success. He extended trade credit, moved stock, smiled through pressure, and kept the shell of prosperity polished even as the inside began to hollow out. Britain, after all, is a nation that applauds the costume long after the body has given way. He sold equipment to people like Ian on terms because that is how business is done when liquidity is scarce and everyone pretends next month will be cleaner. Credit oils the machinery. Credit also poisons it, of course, but one does not say that aloud while trying to hit quarterly figures. Jack told himself he was supporting growth, enabling work, keeping customers loyal. In reality, he was absorbing risk from increasingly unstable people inside an increasingly unstable economy. When Ian's payments faltered, Jack's cash flow shuttered. One unpaid invoice became a delayed supplier payment. A delayed supplier payment became pressure on payroll. Pressure on payroll became frantic juggling between VAT, trade accounts, leases, and the sort of minor business expenses that suddenly develop fatal importance once revenue stops behaving. He tried to hold the line. They all do. He covered gaps personally, moved money around, paid one urgent thing by delaying another. The books began to resemble improvisation. Outwardly, nothing too dramatic. Inwardly, panic had entered the wiring. Council tax arrears, neglected because everything else seemed more immediate, swelled in the background, breeding their own menace. Small debts are never truly small once handed to the machinery of enforcement. There is a point in every decline where the performance becomes grotesque. Jack was nearing it. He still took calls in a confident tone, still spoke of pipeline, recovery, near-term visibility, still acted as though this were a temporary squeeze rather than structural collapse. That is what the British striver does when suffocating. He straightens his collar and continues lying in complete sentences. Then the enforcement process advanced. Final notices, compliance deadlines, formal escalation, the kind of language that begins as administrative and ends with men at your door. High court enforcement has a particularly English flavor. Part law, part theater, part medieval morality play, performed in a semi-detached drive. One day it is a letter, the next, boots. When they came with the efficiency of private ruin. Vehicle identified, goods assessed, entry demanded. Jack's motor car, his equipment, bits of domestic life, all suddenly translated into recoverable value. The shell of success was no longer protective. It had become a catalog. There is something marvelously savage about the moment a man realizes his possessions have stopped being symbols and started being inventory for seizure. The neighbors notice, of course, that is part of the punishment. Financial destruction in Britain is rarely complete until accompanied by social embarrassment. Curtains twitch, a child sees the van, someone whispers. Jack stood there not merely as a debtor, but as a failed performance. The rich exterior, the carefully managed impression, the whole theater of solidity, stripped by men with clipboards and statutory authority. And what had brought him here? Not champagne excess, not cartoon vice, a chain, Ian's default, Harriet's cold, Gareth's pension stress, Fiona's unpaid invoice, Edward's tax and refinancing squeeze, Daphne's negative equity and guarantee trap, Colin's remortgage cliff, Beatrice's dead pub, Alistair's leverage, and above it all, the old banking sin stamp named so plainly. Money claims multiplying, ownership concentrating, ordinary lives left to absorb the recoil. Jack had tried to remain looking rich while being hollowed out, yet that is not merely personal vanity, it is what the system trains. Keep trading, keep smiling, keep borrowing, keep the front immaculate, because the moment you look distressed, credit tightens further, counterparties panic, and the whole costume party begins to smell the corpse. When the bailiffs took the car and marked the goods, Jack understood what the others had learned in their own dialects of ruin. In this order, debt is not a tool, but a ranking system. It tells you who may still pretend and who must now kneel. He had sold devices meant to make modern life function. In the end, all the screens, all the stock, all the turnover meant nothing beside a legal power greater than his cash flow. And so the circle closed. From the banker's pen to the bailiff's knock, from leverage to repossession, from abstraction to confiscation. That is modern finance in its finest British tailoring. So there they are, 10 lives, each one told that the problem was personal, local, manageable, somehow their own. Alistair was arrogant, Beatrice overtrusted, Colin overextended, Daphne believed paper prosperity, Edward bought too much on debt, Fiona had no cushion, Gareth reached for safety through structures that were not safe, Harriet trusted the pension promise, Ian used credit to do what families should do, Jack kept the facade upright too long. All true and all insufficient, because beneath every individual flaw sat the same machine. Banking conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Deposits created with a flick of the pen. Assets inflated beyond reason. Credit extended when it fattens balance sheets. Withdrawn when it strangles the borrower most efficiently. A system in which the earth may be taken from bankers for a moment, only to be bought back again through the miraculous generation of claims. How eagerly people participate, how faithfully they repeat the lie. They call debt leverage when the rich use it, responsibility when the poor repay it, and shame when the middle class cannot. They kneel before rising house prices, worship paper gains, and confuse access to credit with admission into safety. Then the rate resets, the market turns, the statement arrives, and the liturgy ends. The cruelty is not accidental, it is design. The banker exports the loss, the lender reprices, HMRC waits, the pension recalculates, the meter blinks, the letter falls, the bailiff knocks, and each person, isolated in his or her own room, thinks for a brief, miserable while that the humiliation is unique. It is not unique, it is systemic. Sir Josiah Stamp warned them in language so brutal it should have ended the discussion. It did not. People still trusted the screen, the property valuation, the monthly statement, the fixed rate, the pension illustration, the friendly credit line, the promise that one more refinancing, one more quarter, one more year of discipline would bring them to shore. But shore was never the destination. The destination was always ownership consolidation, bought back with a flick of the pen. And the tragedy, the almost comic, almost unbearable tragedy, is that human beings keep calling this civilization right up until the moment the red letters hit the floor.